Hello everyone and welcome to this Global Fleet Champions webinar on managing driver speed. If you're new to our webinars, Global Fleet Champions is a partnership campaign administered by Brake, the road safety charity, to prevent deaths, injuries and pollution caused by vehicles driven for work. To learn more about the work that we do and to access fleet safety resources and more of our events, please visit globalfleetchampions.org. Our webinar today looks at managing driver speed, and we've got some fantastic speakers who will be discussing why this is an important part of any fleet safety programme and the measures that you can put in place to help address it. And this webinar is part of the build-up to Road Safety Week New Zealand as well. And so a big thank you to the headline sponsor of the week, Waka Kotahi, for their support of Road Safety Week, which has enabled us to run this webinar. So on to today's speakers. I'm delighted to firstly introduce Anna Bray-Sharpin. Anna is Principal Advisor for Speed, Infrastructure and Urban Mobility in the Safe System at Waka Kotahi, the New Zealand Transport Agency. Prior to joining Waka Kotahi in 2019, she was an Urban Mobility Associate in the World Resources Institute Centre for Sustainable Cities based in Washington, DC, where she worked with cities around the world to make their streets safer and more accessible as part of the Bloomberg Initiative for Global Road Safety. And we're delighted to have her as part of the session today.
Okay, so I'll be talking to you today about the importance of safe speeds, just framing up the details that the rest of our panelists are bringing today. So I just wanted to start just by sharing with you a bit about the framework that we work within at Waka Kotahi. So basically we're within the Road to Zero National Road Safety Strategy for 2020 to 2030, and that sets a goal for reducing deaths and serious injuries on New Zealand's roads by 40% by 2030. Within that, to guide us for the first 3 years, we have an action plan which sets out 15 key starting points for working towards that goal. So just a bit more about the Road to Zero program. It's based on the vision that in New Zealand, no one should be killed or seriously injured in any road crash. And that vision is underpinned by the guiding principles, which are based on the Safe System approach. We've drawn from the Safe System approach because internationally, the evidence shows that that's the approach that gets the fastest and most significant results by taking an integrated and holistic approach to road safety. So basically, those guiding principles are that we plan for people's mistakes. We understand that humans make errors and they shouldn't have to pay for those with their lives or with other people's lives on the road. And so part of that is designing for human vulnerability, both the likelihood of making mistakes and also the physical vulnerability that people experience, particularly those who are not protected by a vehicle in a crash but might be outside a vehicle. We strengthen all parts of the road transport system. So as I mentioned, this approach is really integrated. We're not trading off parts of the system against other parts. And we have a shared responsibility for improving road safety. So we will do our utmost to create a safe mobility system, and road users have a responsibility to behave safely within that system. As I mentioned, our actions are grounded in evidence, and that's why it's based on the Safe System approach, and they're evaluated. So that's why we have milestones and targets to make sure that we're keeping pace and doing what we said we'd do. Our road safety actions support people's well-being and livable places. I can't emphasize enough the way that road safety doesn't just save lives and avoid serious injuries, but it also makes our communities more livable and gives people the opportunity to take active and healthy transportation options. And finally, road safety is integrated into the system. It's not a luxury that we add on at the end, but rather a foundational element of the mobility system. So I'm speaking to you today from my perspective in the focused area of infrastructure and speed. We have 5 different focus areas. My colleague Paul will be speaking next, and he comes from the workplace focus areas. And our work in these focus areas cross-cuts with those of our colleagues in road user choices, vehicles, and system management. So as a starting point, the question is speed a problem in Aotearoa? It certainly is, but there are probably more problems than we necessarily are always aware of. So there's 2 key types of problem. One is when the posted speed limit is appropriate, but it's exceeded. And whether it's by a little bit or a lot, either can cause significant impacts in terms of safety. And then also when the speed limit is not safe or appropriate. And that's actually surprisingly common in New Zealand. Actually, over 90% of our roads don't currently have a safe and appropriate speed limit in terms of the types of people and vehicles that are using them and the type of infrastructure that's provided. So sadly, that means that, for example, in 2019, 162 people died on our roads on roads that didn't have a safe and appropriate speed limit. So they weren't being set up within the safest possible mobility environment to begin with. And as I've mentioned, unsafe speeds don't only cause deaths and serious injuries in New Zealand, but they can cause severance, and they're a deterrent to people opting for active and sustainable modes of transport. So the flip side is that by creating safer speeds and improving road safety, we have a lot of opportunities to improve our communities. So due to this, within the Road to Zero program, we have a specific program called Tackling Unsafe Speeds in New Zealand. And this has 3 different areas that it's approaching. The first is improving how councils and the Transport Agency plan for, consult on, and make speed management changes by simplifying the regulatory framework and making it more effective. We also have a strong focus on safety for children, focused on lowering speed limits around schools so that children are safer and also more comfortable walking and biking to school. And we're going to have a new approach to safety cameras, reducing speeds on the highest risk roads. So coming back to why managing speed is so important and the real crux of the presentation today. Although speed is often reported as being the leading factor in around 30% of fatalities, and this is a pretty common statistic that you'll hear globally, it's actually a factor in every single crash, because without movement, we don't crash. And the movement that we do have is what affects the severity and the outcomes of a crash. So speed affects the likelihood of whether a crash will take place in the first place or whether it can actually be avoided. The outcome of that crash, is it a minor injury, a serious injury, or a fatality? And as I've mentioned and will continue to reiterate, it also really affects our living and travel environment, particularly safety for children and other vulnerable groups. So there are a few reasons why speed has such a big impact on the outcomes of a crash and whether a crash happens at all. I'm just going to step through a few of those now. So the first is the way that it affects what we see. So as our speed increases, we actually get a cone or a tunnel effect with our vision, which means that we're less likely to be able to see or let alone respond to hazards or unexpected events taking place beside us. Secondly, speed affects our ability to stop, and there's 2 components to that. One is the sheer distance that we can travel while reacting before we even put our feet on the brake in a vehicle. And then once we do manage to put our foot on the brakes, how far the vehicle can travel before it actually comes to a stop. And this is something that we frequently underestimate as drivers. So just to put that into a visualization there, this gives you a clearer idea that at around 30 kilometers an hour, we might need 8 meters to respond to an unexpected situation, but it'll take another 6 before the vehicle actually comes to a stop. So we're getting close to 15 meters in distance that we've traveled just since perceiving something unexpected on the road. Getting up to 50 or 60 kilometers per hour, you'll see that rapidly increases to 40 and then over 50 meters. And as well as this, higher speeds have a greater impact on the human body, yet we're just not evolved to perceive the risks very well. And this is particularly the case for children who don't have even have risk perception as well developed as adults do. So, for example, although being hit by a car at 50 kilometers per hour has similar effects to falling from a 3-story building, we're generally a lot more comfortable standing on the side of the road where vehicles are traveling at 50 kilometers per hour, or driving in a vehicle at that speed, much more comfortable than we would be standing on the edge of a building looking down 3 stories without anything between us and the ground. So those are some of the reasons that the impact of speed is often underestimated by people when we're thinking about crashes and crash risk. But the evidence is really clear. If you look at what's called the speed severity relationship, just a 1% increase in speeding can result in increasing injury crashes by 2%, severe crashes by 3%, and fatal crashes by 4%. So the risks go up very quickly. That's why even exceeding the posted speed limit by only a few kilometers per hour can actually have a much more dangerous impact than people often realize. But it's also conversely why reducing the speed by only a few kilometers per hour can actually dramatically improve safety. So just to put another visualization here to get a sense of what this actually looks like in terms of deaths and serious injuries on our streets. This is an example based on the likelihood of a pedestrian or a cyclist dying if they're hit by a car at different speeds. So although at 10% they've got at 30 kilometers per hour, there's a 10% chance of a fatality, which actually means that there's a 90% chance of a survival rate. With what may appear to be a relatively small increase in speed, the difference between 30 and 50 kilometers an hour, we actually see that flip. So a pedestrian or cyclist has more like a 15% chance of surviving. So this is really important information because it actually gives us a steer on what safe and appropriate speed limits on our streets and roads should look like. So under the safe system approach to road safety, we consider that the safe and appropriate speed limits should align with basically the users and the types of vehicles that are present on a road, and a speed at which all of those users present would have a 90% or higher chance of survival. So when this translates into thinking about what speed limits might look like on our streets and roads, in locations where we see a lot of vulnerable road users and there's a risk of vehicles conflicting with and crashing with them, then an appropriate speed limit would be around 30 kilometers per hour. When the typical risk is more like crashes between vehicles at intersections, that's largely survivable up to 50 kilometers per hour. And when there's a risk of a head-on crash, that looks more like 70 kilometers per hour. Any speeds higher than that, 80 to 100 kilometers per hour, are really only safe and appropriate where there is infrastructure in place to prevent head-on crashes from taking place. So that would be when things like median barriers or totally separated lanes of traffic start to come into play. So how do we actually get there and achieve our safe speeds? I've been focused very much in this presentation today on setting a safe and appropriate speed limit. That's a really important starting point, but it's not enough on its own. That needs to be the foundation. And then the safe system, as I mentioned, requires an integrated approach that wraps around this. So that would be accompanied by promoting and enforcing the speed limit, designing streets to make sure that they're appropriate for the speed limit. So the design of the street is sending a message to the road users about what, particularly the drivers, about what an appropriate speed to travel down there would be. And in some cases, the design of the street actually prevents vehicles from traveling at speeds higher than that. And then, of course, getting communities on board. So we're already seeing a real shift in demand around safer speeds for communities, particularly for safety around children and other vulnerable users. But obviously, there's always a lot of concerns whenever there's a change to the status quo. A lot of questions and concerns will come up. So that's why it's really important to have a lot of conversations around the negative impacts of speed, but also the wider benefits to a community, and also the impacts of lowering speeds, which are often much less significant than people fear. So I'll pass back to you on that note, Caroline, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today.
And so our next speaker today is Paul Harrison, who is a Principal Advisor for Work-Related Road Safety within the Road to Zero programme at Waka Kotahi. He has held a number of roles advising businesses and working on workplace injury prevention at the Department of Labour, ACC and Waka Kotahi. And this experience has given Paul great insight into the challenges and opportunities of managing the risk of vehicles, both at a strategic level and every day for companies as well. So it's great to have Paul as part of this session today too.
And thank you very much for that previous presentation there. That was great, Anna. So one of the first things that I just wanted to talk about is that in the experience that I've had is that when you're managing speed at work, there's two clear pathways that you can take. The first pathway that you can obviously take as an employer is to be reactive, to basically not be in front of the game and to just take it as it comes. And that often seems like it's a simple and easy way, but there are issues there. Or alternatively, there's a proactive approach, which can be a little bit more complex, but it's definitely the right way to go. What I've observed is there's often four roles that play out when you're talking about a reactive response managing speed at work. The first one is the Ostrich Approach, which is basically we put our head in the sand and hope it's all okay. And you often see this when an employer finds out or is told by an employee that they've had a speeding infringement, and you get the, oh, she'll be right, mate, it's just how it is. That's one of the approaches that you see here. The second one I call is the headless chicken approach. Often the headless chicken approach is where you suddenly do, as an employee, get a visibility of the amount of speeding that occurs within the fleet that you've got. And because you haven't got a particular program of work or an approach in place, then all of a sudden there's a panic to stand something up. Third one is what I call the hostile hawk. What this is basically when there is a problem with an individual, and the approach from the employer tends to be to go after that individual in a very sort of punitive way. And then the final one is what I call the cuckoo approach, where you lay the problem in someone else's nest and then expect that they're going to deal with it. And often this happens within large organizations when they're trying to look at who within the organization actually deals with the whole issue of managing speed. Is it the HR department? Is it your health and safety team? Who is it that actually owns the incidents when they occur? Who is it that's responsible for the programs to stop the incidents of speeding occurring? I just wanted to take 1 second just to bring up some stuff that we had in our New Zealand public attitude survey that we had. And the reason I thought I'd bring this one up is we've got to realize that employees are people, and we all bring our attitudes from outside the work into the workplace when we do. And of course, so people's opinions of speed and speeding are actually quite critical when you're thinking about how you're approaching your program of work and managing speed within a workplace sort of construct. So as you can see on the screen there, a large group of those surveyed, 44% think the risk of being caught speeding is small. 83% of respondents think the speed limits on the roads they normally use is safe and appropriate. I put one stat in there about fatigue, and I just wanted to put that in there, and then I'll clarify that a little bit further down the track. And then basically the bottom bullet point there, when they were informed that 350 people were killed on our roads, 44% of those respondents thought 0 deaths would be an acceptable number next year, and 15% thought that more than 200 deaths would be acceptable. So often that's what people's risk acceptability is. And when you bring that into the workplace construct, if you ask people from a workplace perspective, from health and safety, what would be an acceptable level of people to be killed in a workplace in health and safety, I often wonder what that response would be from people. So what I've got here on the graph down here is a survey that was done in 2011 in Britain of about 1,000 odd people and the reasons that they gave for speeding. So obviously they talk, and interestingly, first one off the rank there is saying to stay awake, and that comes back into what I just had before about the amount of people who have actually said that they've had trouble staying awake while driving to or from work or driving as a part of their work. So often some people actually speed because of the effects of fatigue. There's feeling stressed, obviously someone close behind them, feeling angry, the limit's too low for the road in their opinion, or there's an empty road day or night, running late, keeping up with traffic, or overtaking. And often the overtaking one is quite interesting when you do talk about it with staff, and there's a whole acceptability that you speed when you overtake, rather than a risk-based approach of actually saying, well, why did you need to overtake? Oh, because they were going too slow. And then it would be, well, what's wrong with that? Was there a risk from them going too slow? So often there's that sort of cultural sort of thinking that people bring into that you do have to sort of take in mind with it. So obviously, if these people were driving for work, what could be some of the workplace factors that sit behind how they feel about speed? So obviously, journey planning, excessive hours working, meeting scheduling, poor fatigue management, or no communication from their employer on speed management. So one of the things that often you get is that people feel they speed when they're time pressed. And as an organization, if you've got staff moving between different offices for meetings, often what tends to occur is because you want to get the most out of a day, we set our meetings very early in the morning, without the realization that staff who are traveling to those meetings may be driving for a few hours to get there, which means that they have to start their day very early, and then becomes a fatigue issue, which then can actually translate through into speed. And remember, it's not all about the employee blaming. Sometimes it's those workplace factors that actually put those people in the positions, either where they consciously or unconsciously actually speed. So what are the issues around managing speeding at work? First of all, seeing the problem. So generally, employers are not generally driving with their employees. So if you're not using telematics, sometimes the speeding is pretty invisible. In New Zealand, standing camera infringements, so those are speeding infringements that come from either mobile vans or fixed cameras, generally make it to the employer because it goes to the registered owner of the vehicle. The police give an infringement, so when an employee is pulled over on the side of the road, may not if it's a light vehicle, as there's a reliance on the employee to make the employer aware. The employer isn't actually notified of that as the infringement is given to the individual driver. Unless, of course, their license is compromised and the employee is using Driver Check, which is a service that we offer here at Waka Kotahi for employers to be notified in a change of circumstances in an employee's driving license. So basically, employees can be reliant on public reported incidents of speeding. Another big issue is the understanding of the problem at all levels of the organization. So why is why reducing speed is important? You might get different views in the different layers of your organization. You might get a very engaged executive team who are fully into basically driving down the actual amount of speed at work, but in the middle management area or in the employee area, you may get a bit more resistance, or they can't actually see the reasons why. So often you get this mismatch between that. Also, what does good look like and what level of risk is acceptable? And also gathering, understanding, and applying the data. And again, we come back down to if you don't have something like a telematics system in, how are you actually getting that visibility and gathering that data? When you do have a telematics system that's in there, are you using it for all it's worth? And are you actually applying that data in ways that will reduce the speed within your organization? And also ongoing management. So resource and cost is a barrier. Often when you're putting in technologies to manage speed and speed reduction, there's a cost there. There's also the actual resource that goes into managing what all of that tells you. And often many businesses I've seen have done the right thing where they've gone in to go and get some telematics so they can really get an idea of the speeding of their employees, but they don't actually have the resource in behind that to take that data that comes from it and to actually have that process in a program of work. Governance is often an issue with it, but one of the biggest ones that I've seen is who owns vehicle safety in the organization. So is it your fleet managers who are responsible for it? Is it the health and safety team? Is it the line managers? Is it a group of it? So who owns that? And that's where you could often get the cuckoo approach occurring, where different areas in an organization try and push the problems backwards and forwards. And really, there's often no embedded safe driving program that contains speed. So basically, what do we need to have in our systems to manage speed? Okay, the first thing that you need to do is manage road use risk in the same way that you manage other risks and hazards in your business. It's not a separate thing, it is a critical risk for businesses. Build it into the same system that you actually manage other risks with. It's critical that you have a driving policy and that it's clearly laid out and it's communicated on a regular basis. And I can't underscore that enough, is that you have people exiting and entering businesses all the time. You've got new staff coming in, and for messages to also stick, there needs to be a certain level of repetition that's there. And it also needs to be very clear in the expectations that you have for your employees around what your expectations around speeding are and other areas of driving for work. Knowing what the data that you have on speeding is and getting more out of it if you can. So doing analysis of the data to understand the trends and what that's telling you. I mean, that's often key, is that if you do have telematics and you are getting overspeed events, where are the overspeed events occurring? Who is it occurring with? What times of the day are they occurring? All of these things can actually give you really good clues as to what's sitting in behind that speeding. And again, also build all that data into your governance and reporting as well. And again, it's just I keep mentioning use of telematics, but if you can afford it, using these in-vehicle management systems is great to get the visibility of that speed. One thing I do recommend, if you can do, is get driver sign-in feature. One reason for doing that is that often people then get their own profile of their own speeding behaviour, which then puts the onus, but also gives responsibility back on the individual driver themselves. But also, if there is an issue with speeding, because people have actually signed on, when it comes to any disciplinary issues later on down the track, there isn't a they said type stuff, or they weren't driving or they were driving. It's very clear who was logged on at the time. And also make sure you've got that ongoing resource to manage the system itself when you've got it in. Ensure your senior management and managers are modeling the right behaviors. And I think that is also key. You cannot be communicating about managing your speed at work, but not have your managers actually showing that as a positive behavior. Building those clear and consistent speed messages into your comms program, communicating the why of not speeding, and highlight the positives. So often a lot of the stuff that you've heard Anna talk about is sometimes news to people. So when these types of education information is done on a regular basis, then it really does help actually get the culture right around managing speed at work. That point just about helping managers having their coaching conversations with staff for speeding incidents. I was just saying it was just quite difficult for a lot of people to have those conversations. So often it can get left out, but often it's empowering your managers to have those positive conversations where they can do around overspeeding, but also when they need to have the more disciplinary conversations, that they're given the ability and the tools to do that. I think that's one of the more critical things that you need. And a big thing is having a clear and consistent process in conjunction with your HR people when disciplinary issues do arise. Ensure that you've got options such as training available, and work with your unions. So the thing is I've talked about being clear and consistent in the messaging and everything else in your policy all the way through this. So when you do have the messaging, you do actually let people know about overspeeds and what the requirements are. When they're not following that, what are those next steps that you're actually taking there? And you need to make sure that you bring the HR into it and make sure that it's done in a fair manner. And finally, just have clear roles and responsibilities throughout the managing of the process and the resource to manage. So make sure that everyone in the process is clear about what they do. So just the last thing I just wanted to talk about is one of the things I see time and time again is when staff are overspeeding, and this comes back to the hostile hawk approach, basically there becomes a punitive aspect to it, which can actually have negative consequences in a whole lot of different ways. And I think the thing is that as an employer, we do come under the Health and Safety at Work Act, but also the Employment Relations Act as well. So what I've got in New Zealand is just a part of the Employment Relations Act there saying that we've got to deal with each other in good faith. And then one of the main keys here is also saying that when there's a decision that's going to affect the employment of an employee, that they have to have access to the information relevant to continuation of employment around the decision that was made and be able to give a comment. And one of the things I do see a lot of is when people are using telematics, then often staff will come in it, and if there is an issue with their speeding, and they will challenge the fact that they were speeding. So often it's really critical that if you're using telematics, that you have a good relationship with your provider and that you have the process in place for actually getting the background and the data around those overspeed events and making sure that employees understand what that is and how that occurred, and making sure that you have that process in place to managing the overspeeds properly. And that is finished my presentation.
So moving straight on to our next speaker, and we have Chris Lecloose. Chris is a solution specialist for safety and compliance at Teletrack Navman, and he has a wealth of experience in road safety and fleet safety and in helping businesses to identify solutions for their road risk issues. So it's great to have him with us this afternoon, direct from the truck show in Brisbane.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you everybody for being on the call. Yeah, so my background, I'll just share my screen. There it is. My background, for those that don't know, is I was a police officer in Western Australia for 20 years. Much of that time was spent in highway patrol and crash investigations. So I've had a lot of interaction with the after effects of poor road choices, of which, as Anna pointed out, and Paul also did, speed is almost universally a factor. As Anna said, without motion, without speed, there cannot be collisions and therefore no ill consequences. So that's driven me to what we do now in telematics, as Paul was talking about, in using the data to help educate people. What we know is that people generally don't know what their driving looks like. For the most part, fleet operators, and when I say fleet operators, I'm talking about the drivers. They've achieved their driver's license. They've done a competency test, usually when they were in their teens. They've gained their license, but beyond that, very few people engage in any advanced or any defensive driver training. So therefore, they're left up to their own devices to determine what is good, what is bad, what is safe, what is unsafe. Precious few people will deliberately drive with intent to cause harm. That's the reckless individuals. But we still see people driving out on the roads, driving inappropriately for the conditions, for the speed limit, with consideration of the holistic view, which encompasses non-vehicle occupants. So therefore, we're talking pedestrians, etc., as well as the interaction with the road infrastructure. So what I want to talk about is how this in fact impacts managing the driver's speed in the workforce. So from this, we've got to try and understand why we speed. So I've got a little slide there, and it's got 4 levels: the conscious incompetence, subconscious incompetence, conscious competence, and subconscious competence. What those 4 mean is that's the state of mind from all drivers. And a lot of the time, people actually don't know that they fall into one of these categories. For those individuals that are consciously incompetent, they know that they're not good at what they're doing, and in this case, driving. And believe it or not, that's not the worst category to be in, because they recognize that they're not good. When we translate that to the work environment, very few professional drivers that are people that drive for work will ever admit, even if they know, so if they fall into that #1 category of being consciously incompetent, they still won't raise their hand or bring that fact to the attention of their supervisors, because they know generally they will lose their job. The second category of subconscious incompetence, that's the dangerous one, because they're people that are poor drivers, but they don't know it. And often some people that have many years experience while driving fall into this category. They don't know that what they're doing is unsafe. And without that data, without that metric to be able to measure where you are against a benchmark, then you have no gauge. So people that drive in that subconscious incompetent state are a highly dangerous group of people on our roads. The third category are people that are consciously competent. They know what they are doing and they're doing it well. When I talk competence, I'm talking about adherence to the road rules as well as their environment. So not a racing car driver who is consciously competent as a race car driver. We're talking about safe operators from professional driving. And if we can all fall into that third category of being consciously competent, that's where we're going to see some benefits. But it's not likely without education and therefore data. And #4, those people that are good at what they do, they just don't know it. And you tend to find those people fall into that category of, you know, they are pretty good at most things, even if they don't know why. So they're the main contributors. And it's not, here we go, there we go. So we're trying to understand the problem. If, as Paul indicated, an organization does not have a telematics, and I'm not here to sell telematics, by the way, that's not what I do. I'm an educator. But without hard data and without telematics in a vehicle, there's very little an organization can do to educate their staff. And if you remember back to Paul's opening slide, there's the easy way, which is reactive, or there is the hard way, which is proactive. And as the number of people walking displayed on Paul's slide, most of the people went down the easy path and the reactive path. However, various jurisdictions around the world have recognised this and are forcing that compliance through legislation to ensure that organisations understand the problem in a proactive sense. I know in Australia, in many of the states in this country, legislation has been enacted which specifically ensures or requires an organisation to be proactive in the identification of all risks. Now, while that is an umbrella statement for workplace health and safety, because the vehicle was specifically identified as a workplace when being used for commercial purposes, or indeed for remuneration, then all of the auspices for a physical building, as in a physical workplace, now had to be considered for a vehicle. And what that states, and I try to keep things simple so as to not I guess make it difficult for people, is that an organisation needs to demonstrate proactivity in the identification of all risks, and then proactivity in the mitigation of those identified risks. Now, we know statistically that the majority of workplace fatalities work within or in or around a vehicle. So the statistics back that up, that driving constitutes for the most part the highest risk exposure for any employee. But that does not mean that an organisation can sit back and wait for the collision to occur. They've got to specifically identify the risk. And where they have multiple fleet drivers, how do they know who their high risk, medium risk, or low risk drivers are? Without telematics, there's only really three ways you're going to know this. That is by way of an infringement notice, by way of a collision, or by way of the public calling the number on the back of the vehicle saying, I saw your vehicle do X. The problem with all of those three ways is that they are reactive. An incident occurs, Joe Public calls the number, or a collision or an infringement notice is issued, and then you know that there's a problem, and then the organisation deals with it. But by virtue of the fact that this is reactive, it means that the organisation is instantly non-compliant with what is required under the legislation. So I talk to people not so much about what the mechanisms are in order to achieve compliance, but I tend to come, because of my background, from the perspective of when you're called to give evidence to defend yourself in court for something your driver did, can you say with hand on heart that you proactively did everything within your power to identify the risk, and then once you knew what the risk was, you had the policies and procedures as well as the redundancies in place to ensure that this was mitigated? And without that, there are severe and significant penalties which ensue. And in several jurisdictions in Australia, at least, they've gone one step further as to introduce legislation called industrial manslaughter. Prior to the introduction of this legislation, only the police could investigate any death in a vehicle. However, where that death can be attributed to the workplace and the director or the owner of the organisation, through the investigation, has been found to be negligent, then they will likely face a prosecution of industrial manslaughter and will face incarceration. And there is now case law in position for that. So rather than sitting back and saying to organisations, we hope you do your due diligence, now the legislators have mandated it, and WorkSafe in the various locations are starting to actively investigate and prosecute to achieve compliance across the board. So as a fleet operator, we want to understand what the issues are. So we know that, putting that pressure to meet deadlines, organisational pressures, journey scheduling and routing all contribute towards individuals speeding. So it's really interesting with those 4 things is that often it's not the intent of the driver to speed because of insert any answer you wish. They enjoy it, they want to get there faster, it's what they always do, they believe it to be safe. Often these things, these meeting the deadlines, organisational pressures, journey scheduling and routing are pressures that have been applied externally. And once again, legislation has been enacted for heavy vehicles whereby if an investigation can determine that external forces and pressures contributed to an individual driving that therefore contributed in any way to a collision occurring, every person within that chain or that logistical chain that had an ability or held an office to affect change and failed to do so similarly faces prosecution. So we're going down, and it's unfortunate that we've got to go down this path of legislating the requirement for compliance, but for too long we've allowed that to occur voluntarily and it has not been adopted. And then we just find ourselves looking at managing the issue, and that's where the telematics comes into that. I've deliberately not branded that screen because that's not what this is about, but suffice to say, the screen you're looking at is around fatigue management. So the technology not only educates individuals around what their driving looks like against a set of benchmarks, but also assists where technology can use cameras to determine blinking rates, etc., of drivers to determine whether or not they're falling into fatigue, to then manage the amount of hours that they work on the road. And of course, all of that information is fed back to the head office so they can ensure that the people they assign jobs to have the most available hours to them and that there's no chance of a breach. So that's where the power of the telematics comes into that. Not to mention, of course, you can identify, are there individuals who do a lot of speeding, but it's only by a few kilometres per hour, or you have the outliers who ordinarily drive within the given speed limits, but every now and then have a bad day, and that's reflected in some significant speeds that have been achieved. As an example, one of our clients runs a fleet of light vehicles, so Volkswagen Golfs around the country, and we identified that there was one driver within that organisation that knew what the top speed of that Volkswagen Golf was, which was in fact 203 kilometres per hour, despite the fact that they knew that telematics was in the vehicle. So just because it's there, unless the information is interrogated by the organisation, it can slip through the gaps. And that's why it's really critical. And I'll underscore what Paul had said. It's ultimately critical to ensure you have the appropriate technology, the appropriate policies, and the appropriate procedures that factor in those policies to ensure a watertight existence in the interest of ensuring your compliance and the safety of your personnel and all road users. Thank you. I think we're going to have an open question session later, so I'll hand it back to you, Caroline.
Thank you, all of you, for your presentations today. We really appreciate it, all of that. One question that we've got already is around communicating with your drivers, and actually how what are some tips in terms of communicating both the risks involved with speed and why it's really important, but also anything to do with particularly things like the technology that you might be implementing as part of it. So I might come to you first, Chris, if that's okay on that one.
Yeah, thanks for that, Caroline. Great question, because there's always the opportunity for conflict when you're interacting and implementing the change management process. So it's really important to collaborate with the end user. A lot of the resistance we find from organisations and indeed drivers is because organisations implement the technology with the best interests. However, what they've not done is consulted with the end user. And when you don't consult with the end user, they're left up to their own devices. And unfortunately, we always fall into that pessimistic perspective whereby, wow, they're putting this big brother device in the vehicle. Now, if I exceed the speed limit by 1 kilometre per hour, will they know? Yes. Is that illegal? Yes. Will that mean that I'm going to receive disciplinary action? Yes. And when they think that, they think, right, now I'm going to get dismissed, for something that I perceive to be a minor issue. And that's not quite how it works, because although, yes, 1 kilometre per hour is indeed illegal, the statute does recognise that actions must be reasonably practicable. So it would be unjust to dismiss an individual for one event of 1 kilometre per hour, but it would need to look at a pattern whereby that individual did it regularly and did it at a more severe state. But it is the collaboration, speaking to them, helping them understand the intent of the program and being transparent with what those consequences look like.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that, Chris. Paul or Anna, anything that you want to add to Chris's points there?
I think for me, just to also use the channels that are already there, the channels that are being actually employed by your health and safety teams, your comms staff. Make sure that the positive messaging around speed, and I'm just going to put on that the whole positive, not the punitive aspect, the stuff that Anna was talking about, the educative parts is being communicated on a regular basis, because like I said, often the failure is we come out and put in a program of speed and it's all really good bells and whistles right up the front, and then it gets to BAU and you never hear about it again. And it comes down to also the endorsement from your senior management. So if you've got a chief executive who has a regular correspondence with staff, make sure that the concerns around speeding and why we're actually managing that speed to keep you guys safe on the road is actually communicated from that top level as well. So I think it's getting that sort of slow and consistent messaging that's positive, keeping going forward. And then as you bring in, and like Chris was saying, the consultation process, and especially with the unions, is very critical as well. So you can get people's concerns up front before you put something in. And I think that's the big thing, is the more that they understand about the why, the more that they understand about the how it's going to be done, and then what's going to occur after it, the better that is communicated, the better results you'll get. It's always the wrong idea to actually try and do all that communication after the fact, because the horse is bolted at that point.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Just to add there, excuse me, on Paul's point about communicating the positives, I think there's also a lot of opportunities to build upon all of those foundations and help drivers understand the opportunity that they have to have both positive and negative impacts within their wider communities based on the way that they're driving. And a common example of that is connecting bus drivers and bicyclists so they can understand each other's experiences when they're using the road next to each other.
Yeah, great example. Thanks, Anna. Okay, we've got another question, which again is probably for you first, Chris, but it's around how accurate is the GPS tracking? So would it stand up to scrutiny in an employment relations situation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that we get often. There are many different telematics providers, and there are different ways of achieving the data, from high Earth orbit satellites, low Earth orbit satellites, speed measuring on gearing within the vehicle, etc. I'm not going to go too much into that, but suffice to say, with our technology, we ensure that it is of the highest quality and that it does meet the threshold for evidence in court. And we have been called on many occasions to provide evidence for crash investigators, for prosecutions in court, around the veracity of the data, as well as achieving class rulings from organisations such as the Australian government, with the Australian Tax Office, etc., around accuracy. Others may not have that, so it's really important that if you're, vetting through telematics providers, that is one of the key aspects, because the last thing you want to do is utilise the data to then administer disciplinary action, which may lead to dismissal, have that challenged in an industrial relations court, and then found to be invalidated by the lack of accurate data. So make sure that that data is in fact accurate to that level. The next part to the answer, and this is one we get that always follows, if your data is that accurate, can I not use your data to defend myself and or my personnel against an infringement notice for speeding by a camera? And the short answer is no. there, because the government, the police, and I come from that background, if the charge you are trying to defend is speeding of its own, then the only admissible court evidence must be from a speed measuring device approved by the government, of which no third-party telematics device will achieve. However, where the charge is a criminal aspect, such as dangerous driving, occasioning death, etc., therefore it's under a different statute and does not require a speed measuring device as approved by a minister.
Great, thanks, Chris. Anything, Paul or Anna, you want to add to that? Great, very comprehensive answer there, Chris. Thank you for that. And so one final question, just before we wrap the Q&A session up. So for a perhaps smaller fleets that are just starting out and also often have low budgets as well in terms of what they can do to implement measures. Just a quick answer from each of you as to where would you start in terms of managing driver speed? What would be kind of the first thing that they could look at as a smaller fleet? So if I come to you first, Chris, and we'll just go around.
I'd say keep it simple. Don't try to change the world overnight. Identify 2 or 3 major objectives. Consult with your organisation, including the drivers and the unions if you have them, and start small.
Great, thank you. Paul?
I think the positive of actually having a small fleet is you do have more of a relationship basis in smaller companies between the actual management and the employees. So you do have the ability to have those strong conversations and to be actual have that more positive engagement around speed and around health and safety in general. And I think that's one of the first things, like I agree with Chris, keep it simple. If you can look at putting in some more of the lower cost measures like using Wakatai's driver check, that's a way of putting some tools in there, but also it's giving staff perhaps even time off for a few hours to actually look at some material that you might have got for them. So, you can do very simple things to actually help. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Paul. And Anna?
So fleet management isn't my area of expertise, so I would just come back to the principles of the Road to Zero strategy and the SAFE system, and just emphasize that safety isn't a luxury. So even with a small budget, it's something that you want to think about at the core of your fleet management. And I think Chris and Paul have done a great job of outlining how you can do that right from the beginning and not wait until you have a larger fleet or budget.
Yeah. Great, thanks very much, all of you. That's brilliant. And thank you to everyone who put forward questions. We appreciate you doing that as well.
Hello, my name's Lee Gray. I'm the Health and Safety Coordinator from Maida Group. We're a mechanically minded business based in Australia. With over 1,450 employees and over 600 vehicles in our fleet, spread not just over Australia, but also internationally. With 570 vehicles fitted out with the Mixed Telemetrics 4000 IVMS monitoring system, vehicles do on average at 25,000 Ks per year. Within Maida, we identified 4 focus areas for our vehicles that we wanted to focus in on. The first one was monitoring speeds and other vehicle incidents more closely. Vehicle incident for us isn't just vehicle collisions or crashes, it's also speeding offences, driver behaviour. Having the ability to monitor and track our vehicle speeds and ensure that they are following the appropriate speed limits for the site and driving into conditions is something that was important to us, being that our vehicles are heavily branded with our logos, and it's one of our biggest risks within the business. Ensuring that the vehicles are driving to the speed limits is something that we pride our fleet on, and ensuring that where our clients have set reduced speed limits, that we can also follow them as well. Having the live tracking and the driver feedback is something important to us to ensure that their drivers were performing. And also, if the event of an incident, we could also track and monitor and see what the journey was shown prior to the event. Another focus area for us was communication between driver and base. Large portion of our journeys are driven where there's little to no mobile phone coverage. So the reliance on Iridium and confidence in having a system that can relay messages back to base in the event of an incident occurring was important to us. And even if it's something from a vehicle versus wildlife or vehicle versus vehicle incident, or even something as simple as a vehicle becoming bogged in a remote area following a weather event, having the employees have the confidence and the ability for us to respond and provide them assistance was something that was reassuring for them and also reassuring for us. One of the other focus areas was follow-up following an event. So having the ability for the car to report an event occurring. So in the event the vehicle has potentially occurred in a collision, for it to report back to us and saying that this vehicle has been involved, we can then follow up with the driver and provide them with assistance should they need it, or provide the relevant information for the authorities if it was needed for an investigation. The last area is obviously the big one for us is fuel usage and driver behaviour. Having so many vehicles, 600 vehicles driving around doing excessive kilometres, our fuel usage and fuel burn is something we keep a focus on as the cost of diesel continues to rise. Having the ability to monitor drivers' performance around acceleration, deceleration and cornering has seen a good reduction of fuel usage and fuel monitoring. Also assists with different rebates and claiming back from clients fuel kilometres. Driver behaviour is one that I spoke about earlier. That's also a key one for us to ensure that the employees given these vehicles with the branding representing themselves as well as our business, that their driver behaviour is what we expect, and that we know that if people are out there seeing our vehicles around, they can be assured that the drivers are driving the correct manner and being good community users of the road. Why Mix 4000? We did a lot of research around different vehicle options and different IVMS systems, and Mix was out of the box the best choice for us. It just provided the all-in solution that we needed and desired for our vehicles. It's given us the ability to monitor all our vehicles across all states of Australia, running around the back streets of Africa and places like that, where there's little to no phone coverage, and to know that our vehicles are moving and then they're safe. Accurate tracking was also good for us. So, we've had an event where an employee was diverted down a back street in a remote part of the Pilbara in WA, and then became bogged without the ability to zoom in and to actually find the exact location of the vehicle. We wouldn't know where that driver was. So the ability to scroll in, zoom in, and spot the vehicle and send a recovery vehicle to collect it was paramount in ensuring that the person wasn't left out in the elements for a long period of time. The ability to see where vehicles are and when they're moving. We have some controls in place within the business around driver behaviour and vehicle usage. And we limit the usage of vehicles between the hours of 8 p.m. and 4 a.m., just the nighttime periods, other than internal site driving. Have the ability to see if the vehicles are moving or being driven outside those hours, and to follow up the employee to make sure that if the vehicle is being driven, that there is a journey management plan that's been approved by the relevant supervisor in place. Just adds an extra layer of supervision without having to micromanage. Also gives us clear, constant communication with our drivers. Why the drivers get phone calls for harsh cornering, harsh braking, what they think they might have gone unseen or unnoticed previously. They know that they're being monitored, and it's not with a big stick, it's for driver education. And they know that if something does go wrong, that they've got the ability that we can rely on them. And being that we are such a big brand, we needed to align ourselves with another reliable product that we could not only use in our own vehicles, but also promote to our clients. for use within their fleet as well. So practicing with NICS, whilst we've put it through all our vehicles, we've also recommended it to our own clients who've started putting it in their vehicles as well. Being that we're talking mining companies that invest heavily into safety devices, this was one thing they all jumped on board with to see if we were committed to it, they were going to commit to it as well. What results we've seen? Greater driver behaviour. The number of complaints about drivers' behaviours has dramatically decreased. We do still receive feedback, but generally today's feedback has gone from the negative to more the proactive and the courteous driver responses. We've seen a good reduction of our fuel usage and tyre wear. Not that they were driving dangerously or badly before, but just where there's a focus on knowing that, hey, the vehicle's been monitored, my movements are being tracked, has seen the reduction of the accelerations and the harsh braking and harsh cornering and stuff on gravel roads. We've seen a reduction to 0 for our vehicle crashes, where it's a driver fault. Obviously, with the different feedbacks, the drivers are more aware about their movements and their actions, and it's just seen a greater attention to their movements. And we've also seen a reduction in speeding occurrences with the forced feedback around waypoints and IBMS tracking and the beeping from the machine inside the cab. Has seen a good reduction of occurrences and less infringements coming through and less feedback from clients regarding incidents. All in all, the move to an IBMS system was the right step forward for a business of our size to ensure that our vehicles are safe and our employees are going from point A to point B at all times. And we know, have confidence that they can get that safely. And should something go wrong, we can pinpoint exactly where they are. It's also given us the ability to explore different technologies and different methods we can do and add on to the vehicles to grow this technology piece. You know, we're now exploring the different options around dash cams and in-vehicle cab monitoring for driver distractions, which are all options that add on to the current mixed technology. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation today. Should you have any questions, feel free to send them through. I'll be happy to answer.
That's great. Thanks very much for that presentation, Lee. We really appreciate you giving your time to share what's been happening at Mader Group with us all. Just one question for you. You talked quite a bit about the issues that you wanted to address and the technology that you've implemented as well. In relation to driver speed specifically, what else have you implemented in terms of policies or procedures and measures in driver training, that sort of thing, as part of your road risk management program?
So all our employees are required to undertake a four-wheel drive driver training course before they commence in a vehicle. So despite them having previous training, they were required to undertake MADEV training before driving a MADEV vehicle, which we'll work through with different training providers to tailor around our specific vehicles, especially around the design and setup of how the weight is distributed between the height of the vehicle and the four-wheel drive setup. We also heavily worked with the different manufacturers that we use for fitting out the vehicles to ensure that the toolbox design, the way that the heavy tooling is laid across the vehicle, should their vehicle be involved in a collision or a crash, that's not going to pose any additional risk to the driver. So for things like crowbars and pry bars, they're all vertically horizontal to the vehicle and to the cab rather than vertically running towards into the cab. We also have worked with the different tyre manufacturers to make sure that the tyres that we run in the vehicles are the right makeup and the right fit, and that they are running at the right tyre pressure to handle the roads and the journeys that we perform and on the different material types. Speed-wise, the vehicles are set to the maximum allowable speed for the state, depending on what the allowable speed is. We do also reduce the speed in certain states where the maximum is above 110. So Northern Territory within Australia is the greatest speed limit, but all our vehicles are still limited to the same speed limit to ensure that that's the maximum allowable for the vehicle no matter on the conditions. And then we also implement waypoints and geofence different locations based around known high risk or black spots where we would require to reduce speeds as well. And there is driver feedback from the IVMS box inside the vehicle as well to provide them real-time feedback should they go through a waypoint with a greater speed than it's allowable.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Lee.
No.
So I hope you've enjoyed today's webinar and found it useful and interesting. Please do fill in the feedback survey when you leave the webinar. It's really useful in helping us to plan future events. Thank you again to the Road Safety Week headline sponsors Waka Kotahi and to all of our speakers today. And finally, thank you for tuning in. We hope to see you at another webinar again soon.